And I don't, at this juncture, it is hard to find the words. How many more shootings, how many more individuals have to die before we take action? And I rise because my senator colleague, the great senator from Connecticut, identifying these names as a form of prayer, which I could not have said that better, because this is about recognizing those we've lost in order to prevent future loss of life. So I join them to recognize individuals across the country and in my home state of Nevada who have lost their lives. Vincent Brown of Colorado, Zamir Bell of New Jersey, Anthony Stanley of Missouri, Bao Yang, Minnesota, Daisy Navarrete from Texas, David Camacho, Rhode Island, Deontay Minor, Washington, D.C., Ronald B. Williams from Indiana. All of these individuals were killed by gun violence. And just those names would be too many, yet they represent a few in a heartbreakingly long list of victims, families, and communities whose lives have been ripped apart by senseless gun violence just this year. Sadly, my home state of Nevada has been no stranger to this pain. In Las Vegas on October 1st, 2017, a gunman opened fire on a crowd of thousands of people at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. He killed 58 people that night. 2 more victims have since died from injuries they received that evening, and hundreds more were injured. People who just wanted to enjoy an evening of celebration with their friends and family. I know the fear and the trauma that so many families experienced that day. My niece was at that concert. And my family and I, we are incredibly grateful that she made it home safely. But I will never forget, on that Monday after the horrific shooting that took place, sitting at the Reconciliation Center in Las Vegas with the families, with the parents, the uncles, the aunts, the siblings, who were waiting to find out what happened to their loved one. Can you imagine? It is the most horrific thing any family member could go through. You're waiting to hear what happened to your family member, your child, your son, daughter, your niece, your nephew, your father, your mother, and you're hoping that as time and the clock ticks away, that your child is not one that is in the back room with a coroner right now. And I cannot tell you how heartbreaking it was to be with those families and talking to them. And the fear and the anxiety and the helplessness and the hope that still they clung to, that they would find out that their child or their brother or their mother or sister was really safe somewhere in one of the hospitals in Las Vegas. No one can imagine that, and no one should have to imagine that, and no one should ever have to go through that. But that's what families and loved ones have been going through over the years because of the senseless gun violence that is happening across this country. Every day, more than 100 families lose a loved one to gun violence. Austin Cooper Meyer, age 24, from Sparks, Nevada. Brennan Lee Stewart, age 30, from North Las Vegas. Cameron Lee Robinson, age 28, from Las Vegas. Charleston Hartfield, age 34, from Henderson, Nevada, a police officer. Eric Steven Silva, age 21, from Las Vegas. Laura Ann Shipp, age 50, from Las Vegas. Nisha Christina Tonks, age 46, from Las Vegas. Quentin Joe Robbins, age 20, from Henderson. Those are just 8 of the 60 Americans who lost their lives during the Root Harvest Festival in Las Vegas on October 1st. And their names and stories will stick with us forever. But we also have to remember the loved ones they've left behind. So many of these names I know now, not just because of the horrific shooting, but because I have met their family members that they've left behind. Children that were left behind. Children that lost their parent to this horrific gunfire. Husbands and wives, mothers and fathers. It just goes on and on and on. In the next few minutes, I want to share some stories of Nevadans whose lives have been altered by gun violence. Many of these stories are heartbreaking, and they stem from the October 1 mass shooting, which took place in Las Vegas. Before I talk about them, however, I have to also recognize and praise the many heroes who stood up and worked to protect our community that night. After the bullets stopped raining down on the Las Vegas Strip, a former Marine turned a truck into a makeshift ambulance and drove more than 24 people to one of our hospitals. A couple provided CPR to injured victims on the site. And hundreds of concertgoers risked their lives carrying fellow concertgoers to safety. In fact, many younger attendees already had a sense of what to do to stop the bleeding from bullet holes and knew to run for safety in the breaks in between the sounds of gunshots because of training they had received in their schools and workplaces. But after the shooting, I received a letter from a constituent who survived the Las Vegas shooting. And she wrote, "On October 1st, 2017, our life was forever changed. My husband and I attended the Route 91 Harvest Festival. We were having the time of our lives, enjoying the different bands we got to see and singing along with all of our favorite songs. My husband and I were so moved when one of the bands led the audience singing God Bless America. Who would have known that just a few hours later, our lives would be changed forever? When the shooting started, I thought it was firecrackers. We looked around, and then there were more shots. My husband pulled me to the ground, laying on top of me, shielding me from the gunfire. He laid there tense, waiting to be shot, while I laid there waiting for him to go limp. We prayed and told each other that we loved one another. I prayed we would live to see our children raise their children, and I felt Jesus' hands covering us. During a pause in the shooting, my husband pulled me up to start running. I was terrified because we could hear bullets whizzing by and we could smell gunpowder. There were 3 people that I know of who were shot right around us. The shooting continued for what felt like forever. We continued running and ran across Las Vegas Boulevard while the shooting continued. There was so much confusion, and we didn't know if there were more shooters. By the grace of God, my husband and I are unharmed physically. Our emotional scars are still to be determined. Sleeping has been difficult. I have had periods of uncontrollable shaking. I have chronic stomach pains and have difficulty eating. All of this seems trivial compared to the families who have lost mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, and the hundreds of people still suffering with physical injuries. Now, I read that letter because it is not just, as I've said before, about the lives that we've lost, but it's about the lives who are affected by gun violence. Reading that letter is just heartbreaking. And to think that her trauma is experienced by so many other Americans from Las Vegas, from Parkland, from Orlando, and from Boulder. It is a stain on our nation. And I have, since that shooting, been able to meet so many incredible survivors of this shooting, including two sisters, the Marano sisters, who were at the concert that night and are still living with the emotional scars from being there in that horrific shooting. Gina Marano has learned to prepare herself for Independence Day and New Year's Eve, when the sounds of fireworks can sound eerily similar to gunfire. But if a car backfires unexpectedly, she has to start the process of reminding herself, you're safe, it's okay, don't worry. And her sister Marisa, who was also at the festival, says her own daughter has picked up the habit of reacting to loud noises. She said, it breaks my heart because my trauma has now passed on to her. The fear resurfaces for these sisters in so many situations, on anniversaries, including of all the shootings since then, at high schools where Gina was doing outreach to students and feared that she was putting herself at risk of another shooting, passing the Strip eerily during the COVID pandemic like it was on the day of the festival because the Strip was shut down. Anywhere where there is darkness and music, even on an evening out, the sisters still feel the repercussions of that night at the concert. And they are not alone. While the tragedy of the Route 91 shooting may be 3 years behind us, for many survivors, a moment can bring it all roaring back, and many more live in fear that it could happen again. Telemachus Orphanos, a survivor of the Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting, was killed when a gunman entered the Borderline Bar and Grill and shot 12 innocent people on November 7th, 2018. What happened to Telemachus and other 1 October survivors in the restaurant that night was a uniquely American phenomenon that we should not be proud of. We keep having these mass shootings in our country, and it is past time that we act. It's not only what our nation deserves, it's what these families and these survivors and those who lost their lives deserve. The Nevadan who shared her 1 October experience with me ended her letter by stating, I am urging you to pass thoughtful, reasonable controls that will enhance the safety of our society. It is time to take action to protect our mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, cousins, and friends. Please do not sit back and do nothing. And she's right. We cannot sit back and do nothing. We must pass common sense gun legislation like the universal background checks that we have passed in the state of Nevada. That will help keep Americans safe. We owe it to our friends and families and all of the victims who have already been irrevocably marked by gun violence to take action. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my friend, Senator Cortez Masto, for that powerful testimony, for sharing some of these stories, for talking about the impact on families in Las Vegas and throughout her state, and to talk about what this means from a parent's perspective, to think that her own family had to